with Mike Hearn. There would be no point in developing side chains and now getting back to Bitcoin XT in 2015. If Gavin was successful in getting 75% of the miners to come with him, there would be no point in developing side chains, and Blockstream's investors would probably be pretty upset. This was a coup, because not only would this force blocks to get larger, it would also give developmental control back to Gavin and Mike Hearn, as Mike was the only one with commit access to Bitcoin XT. Now I want you to pay attention to the following statement given from Blockstream's CEO. When he was asked if the blockchain forks and Bitcoin XT prevails as the dominant chain, then that also establishes a new core team of developers, with Mike Hearn and Gavin Andresen in sole custody of the source code. How would this change the long-term governance of Bitcoin? Adam Back responded, Gavin naively thinks he'll do a coup, force the issue, and then invite people to participate in the coup. However, Mike states on the Bitcoin XT website that he is the final decision maker, so it's clearly intended to change the decision-making process, and Mike has not been without bias and controversy. It seems quite unlikely from indications I see that any of the core people who maintain Bitcoin's security will participate in Bitcoin XT. It is therefore not clear that Bitcoin XT will have the resources or expertise to maintain its safety and security. On a small side note, I managed to dig up some of the private conversations that were taking place in June of 2015. One of the really interesting logs I found came from June 16th of that year. In the months leading up to Gavin making this proposal, he was trying to raise the block size for a very long time. Blockstream CEO Adam Back was acting like they were in favor of increasing the block size, but they were just acting like he needed to go through the consensus process. But they essentially would never get back to Gavin. They were fully aware that this would never reach consensus among the 5 developers with commit access, because 2 out of those 5 are Blockstream co-founders, and they were basically gaslighting Gavin to waste his time while they could work on their sidechain solution. I've copied this conversation over so they can't delete it, and it's in a paste bin that you can find in the description. In this chat log, Mike Hearn references how he's heard from investors that Blockstream has the power to stop changes from going through in Bitcoin. Gavin mentions that this conversation would go a lot better if we could all assume that we all had the best intentions. And in this chat, he references Bitcoin being controlled by a council of elders, despite the fact that a vast majority was in favor of increasing the block size. I will leave this in the description for you guys to read through, as I think it gives you plenty of insight to what pushed Gavin to try and do a coup. To be fair, I want to recognize that both sides here were vying for control over the project, but as this starts to play out, I lean more towards Gavin having better intentions. I know this is a bit confusing, so I want to do a brief recap of what we've covered thus far. Basically, by this time, Bitcoin has become successful and no longer fears regulation from the government. Since it no longer fears the same regulation, the primary focus is scaling the network so more people can send money on it. Satoshi originally planned on having a hard fork which would create a new currency with a larger block size higher than 1 megabyte. A group of developers funded by venture capital plans on profiting by keeping the block size small. Gavin likely realizes this is happening and creates his Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 101 to try and regain control. For this to happen, Gavin has to get 75% of the miners to start using his version of the software. And finally, Blockstream CEO made a subtle threat about security towards Bitcoin XT. Now, hopefully you understand what's going on because shit's about to get way more hectic. After Gavin posted BIP 101, it really created a sense of urgency to update Bitcoin. Nobody wanted to get left behind, and miners needed to cast their vote and make an informed decision. Naturally, for people to stay up to date, they had to go to one of Bitcoin's main discussion boards. And at the time, r/Bitcoin was the main hub for discussion. But where this gets incredibly sketchy is when moderators of r/Bitcoin ban all discussion of Bitcoin XT. Now, I'm no genius here, but how is anyone supposed to make an informed decision if they can't discuss the topic? Now, you're probably saying, well, why wouldn't people just go somewhere else? Well, when you consider that both Bitcoin Talk and r/Bitcoin were the only main discussion boards with any traffic, and they're both owned by the same person, and that person may or may not have had financial dealings with Blockstream, and the thing you're voting on is time sensitive, so you don't have time to create a new community, altogether makes it look like you're trying to force your will on the community. I mean, when you have someone directly on Blockstream's payroll stating things like, manipulating public opinion isn't censorship, Thamos is one of the most anti-censorship people I know, and I'm not aware of any evidence that r/Bitcoin engages in censorship. And then a conversation comes out with Thamos stating that the way I operate r/Bitcoin is consistent with self-ownership. r/Bitcoin is a private centralized website. I am free to operate it as I wish. I am under no ethical obligation to allow total free speech just because I believe in self-ownership. And my personal favorite, this is in accordance with my principles. I don't take free speech to be an ethical axiom. There would have been no way to prove this conversation was real until Thamos acknowledged it himself. Now, this is a complete 180 from what Thamos used to say before Blockstream was founded. The free and open discussion on this forum help individuals in the Bitcoin community achieve truth. Everyone has some wisdom or knowledge to contribute to a discussion, and everyone who reads the discussion and gains that knowledge gets closer to the truth. This is much more effective than having truth dictated by a handful of moderators or voted on by an electorate. So what could have happened since 2013 that made you change your mind? Blockstream CEO later admitted that Thamos was censoring the subreddit too. However, they claimed that the reason to justify this was because there was vote manipulation going on. They later released a study for proof of this situation, but I find it incredibly convenient that the person who conducted this vote manipulation study was one of the people participating in censorship. Furthermore, I also looked through this study, and the sample data they used was 6 months after this event took place. And I'm highly skeptical because Reddit makes it incredibly hard to track any upvote metrics on their site. Most of the people being downvoted in this data set were the people that were censoring the community and were rightfully hated. It's funny that Bashko would even post this study because even he admitted that this situation escalated to censorship months before. Now, how do we know that Thamos has involvement with Blockstream? Well, in 2011, Thamos mentioned that if people wanted to donate, he would add improvements to the forum. This was the amount of Bitcoin received to his address. Now, after 2 years went by and nothing was the amount of Bitcoin received to his address. Now, after 2 years went by and nothing happened, some people started to ask what was going on. Thamos then mentioned that he planned on creating a new forum software, and instead of, getting help from a community of open source developers, he ended up hiring a no-name studio by the name of Slickage for $100K a month. And tell me, how does a no-name studio land a client for $100K a month when they operated out of this rundown apartment? Inside the technical documents of Slickage's GitHub, a person by the name of Warren at slickage.com was found. People ended up finding out that this person just happens to be the same Warren Tagami that works at Blockstream. This means that when this was found, he was working at the same company Thamos hired and Blockstream simultaneously. I understand that developers can have multiple jobs and it doesn't necessarily mean conflict of interest, but when this company was only used because Warren Tagami used to help Thamos with the forum, and to top that off, this company reports nowhere close to $100K a month in revenue, yet has continued on Thamos' forum software, and it's 2020, and everyone's still using the old forum, something isn't adding up here. To be fair, both Warren and Thamos denied any conflict of interest. They claimed that this evidence was being used to push a conspiracy theory that Blockstream had hijacked Bitcoin Core. But when I tell you who Satoshi Nakamoto is, I think it'll be as clear as day as to what's going on here. On August 15th, 2015, Mike Hearn would write to the Bitcoin mailing list, "Hello. As promised, we have released Bitcoin XT, which includes the Bigger Blocks patch set. You can get it from here. I feel sad that it's come to this, but there is no other way. The Bitcoin Core project has drifted so far away from the principles myself and many others feel are important that a fork is the only way to fix things." After Bitcoin XT was launched, it saw a reasonable amount of success. Despite one side having full control over discussion, many new nodes were running the software. Meanwhile, on the forums, individuals were calling for Thamos and moderators to step down. Due to this monopoly over discussion and no compromise being made, this event divided the community to this day, and this event popularized a subreddit by the name of r/BTC. While the subreddit generally caters to Bitcoin Cash, it originated to discuss Bitcoin free from Thamos' censorship. 40 minutes after Mike Hearn had posted about Bitcoin XT, Satoshi would respond. "I've been following the recent block size debates through the mailing list. I had hoped the debate would resolve and a fork proposal would achieve a widespread consensus. However, with the formal release of Bitcoin XT, this looks unlikely to happen. And so I'm forced to share my concerns about this very dangerous fork. The developers of this pretender Bitcoin claim to be following my original vision, but nothing could be further from the truth. When I designed Bitcoin, I designed it in such a way as to make further modifications to the consensus rules difficult without near unanimous agreement. Bitcoin was designed to be protected from the influence of charismatic leaders, even if their name is Gavin Anderson, Barack Obama, or Satoshi Nakamoto. Nearly everyone has to agree on a change, and they have to do it without being forced or pressured into it. By doing a fork in this way, these developers are violating the original vision they claim to honor. They use my old writings to make claims about what Bitcoin was supposed to be. However, I acknowledge that a lot has changed since that time, and new knowledge has been gained that contradicts some of my early opinions. For example, I didn't anticipate pooled mining and its effects on the security of the network. Making Bitcoin a competitive monetary system while also preserving its security properties is not a trivial problem, and we should take more time to come up with a robust solution. I suspect we need a better incentive for users to run nodes instead of relying solely on altruism. If two developers can fork Bitcoin and succeed in redefining what Bitcoin is, in the face of widespread technical criticism and through the use of populist tactics, then I will have no choice but to declare Bitcoin a failed project. Bitcoin was meant to be both technically and socially robust. This present situation has been very disappointing to watch unfold. Satoshi Nakamoto. Soon after, many threads started to pop up that someone was attacking Bitcoin XT nodes. Kicking them offline made them unable to vote. Bitcoin XT was supposed to reach consensus by January 1st, 2016, and between the span of August to December, two separate conferences were held by the name of Scaling Bitcoin. I want to point out that 2015 was the only year that they held two of these. Bitcoin XT failed to reach a 75% consensus, and on January 28th, 2016, the patch was reverted. I personally believe it to be very apparent that Bitcoin Core didn't play by the rules. In my opinion, this was a community power struggle. Anyone who supported Bitcoin XT was ousted from Bitcoin Core. Coinbase, for example, supported Bitcoin XT and then had themselves deleted off the Bitcoin.org website. I believe that everyone knows who Satoshi is at Bitcoin Core, and the reason you're probably not seeing anyone speak out is because of something called a non-disclosure agreement. So when Gavin came out publicly and said this,
I do think Craig is Satoshi. I met with him in London. He fits the kind of person that I was interacting with way back in 2010, and he provided some cryptographic proof using the private key from the very first Bitcoin block to show that he possessed that key. So although it's impossible to prove something like that 100%, I think for me, he's proved it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Gavin later mentioned that there was a chance he could have been bamboozled by Craig Wright, but I personally think he never thought that Craig Wright was Satoshi, and he was in on it. Craig Wright has been someone who is known to have wanted to have a larger block size. It makes sense that Gavin named someone else as Satoshi because he wanted to win community support over the block size. If Bitcoin Core didn't know who Satoshi Nakamoto was, then why would they revoke Gavin's commit access as soon as he named Craig Wright as Satoshi? They upheld revoking his commit access despite knowing he wasn't hacked. It's almost like they didn't want to see any evidence because they already know who he is. Before I cut to the chase, there's one Reddit comment I want to read from Gavin. In this thread sharing an article about how Craig may have tricked Gavin, someone insinuated that Gavin might know a little bit more about the situation than he leads on. Gavin replied, "I won't violate people's privacy or repeat things told to me under non-disclosure agreements, so I'm stuck. I'm not going to say anything more, except I suspect someday the full story will come out, and it'll be made into a movie." I'm convinced this message is 100% real, and I think you will too when I tell you who Satoshi is, but I completely understand everyone's skepticism with all of the things going on in the community at the time. The email originates from the original Visto mail servers and was not spoofed in any way. The domain owner hadn't changed since 2007. This email was never compromised. Now let's take a look at the writing style. Notice the double space after a period, and Satoshi writes in British English. Notice the spelling of honor. I know there's still some room for doubt here, but that's kind of the point. I'm certain he could have proved his identity, but the goal of this message was to influence people. Once Bitcoin XT failed, there was no longer a reason to follow up. Our final clue is that Satoshi Nakamoto is against a larger block size in the present day, and it's time for me to reveal who he is. When it comes to this or any topic, I have to say the simplest answer is likely correct, and it's no surprise that one candidate literally matches every single detail to Satoshi Nakamoto. Despite how many people will tell you that Satoshi Nakamoto is a collective or Satoshi Nakamoto was made by the government, there's not really any evidence to suggest that. If you recall from part 2, I stated that Satoshi was either trying to throw us off the trail at every given opportunity, or the clues should be taken at face value. As it turns out, he didn't go to that great of lengths to hide his identity. The first clues that we should take a look at are which technical documents were used to create Satoshi's white paper. There are only 2 core ideas that were infused into the creation of Bitcoin. Sure, you had a lot of applied cryptography and other aspects of the project, but the main 1,000-foot inspiration was the B-Money proposal, as it outlined all of the ideas for a digital ledger that we see in the blockchain. And the second component was the proof-of-work system, also known as Hashcash. This is used in the Bitcoin mining function and is used to verify all of our transactions. The person who invented Hashcash was Adam Back, Blockstream CEO. And throughout this video, you may have noticed I put some importance on Blockstream's attachment to a lot of the things that were going on in 2015. So let's take a look at Mr. Adam Back. Adam Back is referenced in Satoshi Nakamoto's very first email. This email was sent to Wei Dai, and in this message, Satoshi was reaching out because he wanted to get the date of publication. The person who invented Hashcash was Adam Back, Blockstream CEO. And throughout this video, you may have noticed I put some importance on Blockstream's attachment to a lot of the things that were going on in 2015. So let's take a look at Mr. Adam Back. Adam Back is referenced in Satoshi Nakamoto's very first email. This email was sent to Wei Dai, and in this message, Satoshi was reaching out because he wanted to get the date of publication for Wei Dai's B-Money. The email reads, "I was very interested to read your B-Money page. I'm getting ready to release a paper that expands on your ideas into a complete working system. Adam Back at hashcash.org noticed the similarities and pointed me to your site." This email implies another message was sent to Adam Back, but what's interesting here is that Satoshi supposedly corresponded with him, but there's no evidence to ever suggest that. We have correspondence between Satoshi and basically everyone else, except for Adam Back. When Adam has been asked about it, he'll always virtue signal and say that he would delete or shred any evidence. That's interesting that you want to protect Satoshi in this case, but when someone who obviously isn't Satoshi like Paul LaRue makes a headline, you'll spread obvious misinformation. That's incredibly convenient, because after going down this rabbit hole, I'm convinced the emails never existed in the first place. The day that B-Money was announced, it didn't get any attention. There's only about 9 discussion threads on the cryptography mailing list about this B-Money proposal, and 2 of them are about the link being broken. This paper was so obscure that the person who actually wrote about it was Adam Back. Don't get it twisted, Wei Dai definitely wrote the paper, but Adam Back copied the paper onto the cryptography mailing list and asked for feedback. In the next email in this thread, it basically outlines the entire thing. B-Money seems to be a book entry eCash system related to Hashcash, the book open and distributed. Anonymity is derived from the fact that participants can be pseudonymous. Hashcash would be a good candidate function for Wei's decentralized minting idea. To create value, you burn CPU time, just like Hashcash, but Wei's distributed open book entry system allows you to pseudonymously exchange value. So here we directly see that Adam just said that B-Money would be a candidate for Hashcash and even mentions that pseudonyms would be a great way to get money out anonymously? I've looked through all the discussion on B-Money on the various mailing lists, and most people didn't even like the idea. Now, if you're wondering whether Adam Back could have pulled it off, I would say 100% yes. He's the perfect candidate. The guy has a PhD in distributed computing systems, which would be the perfect background for building a decentralized computer network. Bitcoin was coded in C++, and Adam codes proficiently in C++. Something we need to consider is that Satoshi Nakamoto is an inventor. He created a new piece of technology. And this guy was filing multiple patents a year up until April of 2005, and then he just disappears until March 2010, which is a full year after Bitcoin was released. I looked through all of the mailing lists that his email was associated to, and he goes dormant from 2007 until 2010. He was also not writing any academic papers during this time. According to Adam Back, Satoshi supposedly even sent him the software once it was released, but according to him, he shrugged it off and didn't mine a single Bitcoin. Adam has never provided proof of these emails either. Now I know what you're thinking, well maybe Adam didn't have any interest in anonymous payments anymore. After all, that was back in 1998. But here's the thing, around 2007, right when Satoshi started on Bitcoin's development, if you read Adam Back's Wikipedia page, which he wrote himself, it reads, he has an interest in privacy technology and electronic cash. So you had time to update your Wikipedia information, stating that you're interested in anonymous payment systems right when Satoshi started development on Bitcoin, but when Satoshi finally figured out how to do something that you planned on doing since 1998, you don't even bother to open the software? How convenient. It's not like you were busy during this time. Call me crazy, but if we dive deeper into Adam Back, more coincidences just start lining up. What about Satoshi's writing style? Well, if you recall from part 1, he uses British English, and whenever possible, he's known to use double space after each period. Adam Back frequently includes double spacing after each sentence in his various writings, and he's British, so British English is also included. Remember how Satoshi hid a political message inside the Genesis block that references The Times, a UK newspaper? Well, what if I told you Adam Back is known for leaving political messages with compact code? And he grew up in London, where the Times newspaper was distributed. Moving on, not many people know this, but web design wasn't Satoshi's specialty. He actually received help in creating the forums from a guy named Marty Malmy. But if you take a look at the earliest capture of Bitcoin.org when it was done by Satoshi, it's incredibly minimalistic. And if you take a look at cypherspace.org, Adam Back's website, and look at the earliest capture, it looks incredibly similar to Bitcoin in layout. Satoshi Nakamoto also looked up to Hal Finney. Do you know who else looked up to Hal Finney? Adam Back. As I mentioned earlier, there's a large gap in Adam Back's digital footprint, and he reappears on Twitter in 2010. When he resurfaces, he becomes a resident of Malta. Malta is the location you move to if you're about to receive a large amount of money that you don't want to be taxed heavily on. Do you remember from part 1 when Satoshi said, "I make this appeal to WikiLeaks not to use Bitcoin"? If you dig through Adam Back's 19,000 tweets to the very beginning when he took to Twitter, his first year on the platform was him advocating about the discussion of WikiLeaks. In 2012, he started updating Wikipedia articles about Bitcoin, providing detailed insight into the history of it. But something you should know is that the guy didn't get involved with Bitcoin until April of 2013. Once again, this guy cared enough about Bitcoin's history to update its Wikipedia article, but not enough to mine a single Bitcoin. It's also incredibly interesting that Blockstream and its entire purpose is to hire people to further the development of Bitcoin. The guy has received over $100 million in funding, but here's the thing, he's never once committed a single line of code.
What? Hehe. Thank you, baby. Thank you. Hindi ko kita sa imong ubang chat. Thank you, baby. Pero okay. Thank you.
How would these investors know the guy's qualified to further the development of Bitcoin? No, is that the guy didn't get involved with Bitcoin until April of 2013. Once again, this guy cared enough about Bitcoin's history to update its Wikipedia article, but not enough to mine a single Bitcoin. It's also incredibly interesting that Blockstream and its entire purpose is to hire people to further the development of Bitcoin. The guy has received over $100 million in funding, but here's the thing, he's never once committed a single line of code. How would these investors know the guy's qualified to further the development of Bitcoin if he's never touched the thing? Either these are the world's dumbest investors, or he's Satoshi Nakamoto. Do you guys want to know the date that Adam Back does finally join the Bitcoin forums and start participating in the community? April 17th, 2013. This is the exact date that an article by the name of The Well-Deserved Fortune of Satoshi Nakamoto came out. He joined back the day everyone figured out how much money Satoshi Nakamoto had. In his introductory post, he starts off bossing people around. He doesn't have a natural progression into the community whatsoever. His first post is telling others to fix certain explanations on the Bitcoin wiki. A few days later, someone ended up linking the post about Satoshi Nakamoto's fortune on the forums, and Adam chimed in saying, "Well, that's kind of an unfortunate privacy bug. Coincidentally, I thought I fixed a few potential issues like this in Hashcash. For Satoshi now, maybe he can find a private buyer via a lawyer and Swiss banking services. Or perhaps we're forced to implement ZeroCoin to protect him. Anyway, don't sweat it, people. He can probably get by on a few million play money and his post-privacy bug fix mining horde, until there's a solution on his post. When was that bug fixed, by the way? I can't tell from those low-res graphs. And he's probably holding out for the 10K Bitcoin era anyway." Have you ever noticed that we only know about Satoshi's first year of mining? Well, it's incredibly interesting here that Adam Back implies an entirely separate hoard of coins. And the bug fix he's referring to is so incredibly obscure. How would you know about a mining bug fix that was never included in the changelogs in 2010 when you supposedly got to the forum 2 days ago? And the fact that he mentioned these Swiss banking services that are confidential, that might explain why Blockstream shifted gears to profit off the block size being small. We may never know, because Adam Back, just like Blockstream, never wants to make the financial intentions clear. Later on, Adam Back actually wrote to the author of this article and said, "Question for the blog author, when was that bug fixed? What proportion of the 130 mil did he spend or cash? That's just curiosity. And I suppose it seems that you're getting too close. You might want to stop in Nakamoto's interest." What I want to clarify here with this entire video is that I'm not saying Satoshi doesn't deserve his wealth or that he doesn't deserve to have control over the project, but what I can see a lot of people having a problem with is when you act like Bitcoin is this community-driven project. Furthermore, acting like Satoshi is living this private life and has to hide from government agencies is a complete virtue signaling lie. And this claim that his privacy needs to remain a secret just because people might come after him for his coins is complete bullshit when you consider that other currencies have faces to them and they can guard their wealth with no problem. That's like saying every rich person has to hide away from the public. This person gives public talks, this person has 150,000 followers on Twitter, and this person is a spokesman for a business. Do you want to know the real reason Satoshi hasn't revealed his identity? I'll let Adam tell you himself.
So first one, in your opinion, who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
I really don't know. I would suspect it's one person, just because of consistency of code and difficulty of keeping privacy and secrets across a group. But other than that, yeah, I think nobody really knows.
If you get an opportunity to know, who is it?
Well, I think actually it's better that we don't know, because it helps for Bitcoin to be considered like a digital commodity, that there was somebody that discovered the commodity, but there's not somebody. People have a background in hierarchical thinking. So some people are wired a little bit different and they don't like authority and they want to think for themselves. But many things about society are hierarchical. And so if you look at what the media tends to do, sort of mass market media, and the average person, they see something new and they want to who's in charge of it? Who should I ask? Could we ask somebody to change something if it doesn't suit us? And so, if there was an identified founder, that thinking would lead lots of people to asking or demanding things. So the fact that that founder is kind of apocryphal news, and presumably he's not coming back at this point, right? That takes away that opportunity,
I mean, heaven forbid people think for themselves, and that seems to be a common theme in the Bitcoin project. In 2015, the entire community was in favor of increasing the block size, but Blockstream and all the other developers forced that upon everyone else. Considering that Bitcoin is supposed to be this censorship-proof money, that's really, really ironic. And not to mention the blatant manipulation when Satoshi wrote that everyone has to agree on a change. If you ever use r/Bitcoin in the present day, it's still heavily censored. You're not allowed to be critical of Bitcoin in any way. Forget that a lot of other projects have already fixed its problems. Because if you don't, and you don't put your faith in it, then Satoshi Nakamoto can't deliver you from the evil banks. Heaven forbid people in a community-driven project ask for something to be catered towards the community. The problem here is a conflict of interest. With hiding your identity, you have two sets of investors to please. Those who invest in Bitcoin, who want it to succeed in the long term, and investors of Blockstream who want to push transactions off the main network to make money. And you've created a borderline cult when the same people that used to be obsessed with decentralization now actively support Blockstream's alternative centralized network. This situation has been very disappointing to watch unfold. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.
Oy, ano palo? Oh, nag-research lang ko further kung si Adam Back ba dyan. Ha? Wait lang.
Hi Adam, I got a question from a live viewer. So it's from Arnhem. In Arnhem, they have the Arnhem Bitcoin Stop initiative, which has got like 100 restaurants and bars and shops and all these sort of. They're actually accepting Bitcoin today, so they're kind of struggling with the fee situation right now. So they're kind of looking for a solution that's ready today, like something they can use as soon as possible. Now, one solution you mentioned is to use off-chain services where people could, put a little bit of money somewhere off-chain at some service provider and payments happen off-chain. The other solution would be to use an altcoin that has very cheap fees. Do you think one solution is preferable over the other, and if so, why?
So I mean, I think the first thing to do is to optimize what you're doing. There's a lot of overpayment of fees. Lightning, maybe they could be an early adopter of Lightning, but
That's not really ready yet, so.
well, I mean, you can download and make transactions and stuff, but I agree that the wallet integration is not complete. And the other thing is that Lightning is forwards and backwards compatible. So people sometimes assume that you would have to make a choice in a wallet between like a savings account and a spending account, but actually it's, in a smartphone wallet, I think you would put all of the funds in a smartphone wallet into Lightning because you can make a payment from a Lightning channel to
Ay, itataglain. Ang tawanan. Yes, kani. My bad, chat. Nata. Think na natas. Yeah. Dumble Rose, baby. Dumble Rose.
Late last week, President Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics after they released their.
Right. Just a second. Let's credit the person who made this. It's how money works, by the way, in case it's not clear. Serpa de Lenta, Walking Dead.
Quarterly Jobs Report. The BLS, which is primarily responsible for collecting and presenting job market data, presented a report that was less than flattering about the current state of the economy for average workers. Late last week, President Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics after they released their quarterly jobs report. The BLS, which is primarily responsible for collecting and presenting job market data, presented a report that was less than flattering about the current state of the economy for average workers. In response, the president claimed that he had issues with the economic numbers for a long time, and that he believed the recent report was phony. Now, hot take alert, but he is most likely absolutely right, just not in the way that he thinks. The July report estimated that the economy had added an extra 73,000 jobs, which was already below expectations. But the real news was that when the BLS ran the numbers again, they realized that they had overestimated May's job creation by 125,000 and June's by 133,000. That means that more than 250,000 jobs that we thought existed never did. And that was just over 2 months. These major readjustments have cast some doubts over the already disappointing numbers from this month, and for many people, it's reconfirmed what they were already thinking. The economy is a lot worse than the numbers are telling us.
The latest jobs report was far worse than expected.
President Trump accused the Bureau's commissioner of rigging the numbers to make himself and fellow Republicans look bad.
Millions of qualified workers hitting the streets every day searching for jobs, but getting rejected.
I got rejected by Taco Bell and Sam's Club.
Making economic policy or business decisions without reliable data is like trying to fly a plane without reliable instruments. It's just not going to work. By their own admission, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government agencies in charge of collecting data have
searching for jobs, but getting
reliable instruments. Economic policy or business decisions without reliable data is like trying to fly a plane without reliable instruments. It's just not going to work. By their own admission, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government agencies in charge of collecting data have produced less reliable numbers over recent years, and it's only getting worse. A week before releasing the controversial jobs report, the Bureau made another press release talking about major compromises they were making in the collection of consumer prices. This data is used to make the Consumer Price Index, which is what they use to measure inflation, so it's kind of important. To make matters worse, everybody from politicians to venture capitalists have started jumping in to provide solutions to a problem they really don't understand. But there are 3 big reasons why these compromises are being made in the first place, and 3 reasons why it's probably only going to get worse. The first reason is that markets are changing faster than ever, and traditional agencies are struggling to keep up with new economic realities. For example, the jobs report that is suddenly stirring up so much controversy is really 2 different surveys: the Establishment Survey and the Household Survey. The Establishment Survey is what was getting so much attention, and it works by asking thousands of businesses and government agencies how many people they have on their payroll for that month. Now, these surveyed businesses supposedly include small, medium, and large employers, but this already presents some challenges. Large employers are more likely to have dedicated human resource departments that can respond to these surveys as part of their full-time job, whereas small businesses on average aren't as timely if they bother doing it at all. The actual survey only takes about 20 minutes, and for a lot of larger companies, it's built in automatically to their payroll software. But for a small business owner already putting in long weeks, a 20-minute survey on payroll statistics often isn't the best use of their time. Even if they do respond to this completely optional survey, it's usually not until after the report has already been published. According to the Bureau themselves, they have been publishing recent reports with as little as 55% of the total eventual collected data, and it's only getting worse every year. To account for this difference, the BLS uses imputed data, which is just a nice way of saying guessing based on previous results. If they are still waiting on lots of small businesses to provide their data, they will look at what small businesses have said in the past compared to large businesses that have already provided their responses and use that to make their report. As any good finance bro will tell you, past performance is always the best predictor of future results. Now, hopefully you all know I am joking, But this system is normally good enough for most months. But the times where this strategy really suffers is during periods of rapid change. Small businesses feel the impacts of bad economic conditions faster and are normally the first to either let go of staff or go out of business completely. So, if reports are only using data from big businesses and then guesstimating the rest, then they won't notice these job losses until they have to go back and do revisions, like what is happening right now. Now, this has been the case since the survey was first conducted. Not to sound too alarmist, but these massive downward revisions were last consistently seen during the run-up to the global financial crisis. But what's changing now is that smaller businesses are just responding less overall, and there are a lot more of them. The rate of new business creation has increased massively since the pandemic. In the past, these were normally real businesses that had a good chance of creating real jobs for real people, and we are still imputing economic data based on that old assumption. When really, what most of these new businesses actually represent is people registering for their side hustle as an Uber driver in the gig economy. This not only goes a long way to explaining declining survey response rates because your average person driving Uber actually represent is people registering for their side hustle as an Uber driver in the gig economy. This not only represent is people registering for their side hustle as an Uber driver in the gig economy. This not only goes a long way to explaining declining survey response rates because your average person driving Uber isn't going to fill out a BLS survey, but it also creates two bigger problems. The first is that it overestimates real job creation based on outdated assumptions. And the second is that even if this data was accurate, it doesn't capture a more pressing reality. We could create 1 million new jobs next month, and it won't do you much good if you are working 3 of them and still can't afford to make ends meet. And so far, all of this is just one report. There are dozens of agencies across America and the rest of the world that are failing to properly account for changing financial realities. So it's time to learn how money works to find out if we can trust our economic data and what it means if we can't. This week's video was made possible by us and our new Spotify page. If you would prefer to listen to these videos or watch them ad-free, the link is in the description. There are a lot of government agencies dedicated to producing data on how the country and the economy is doing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is the one cog in the machine that is making headlines at the moment, but other agencies like the Census Bureau, the Treasury, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, the Department of Agriculture, as well as the data collecting branches of the IRS and the Fed all rely on each other to produce reliable numbers that they themselves put into their own calculations. For example, when the Bureau of Economic Analysis produces GDP data, about 70% of that is based on consumer data collected by the Census Bureau in their retail trade surveys. Interagency data sharing, as this is known, is not a result of laziness, but rather a feature of the system so that every department is overlooking every other department. But you can probably start to see the problems. Uncertainty in any part of the system creates uncertainty in the entire system, and that can be really useful for certain groups. The first are politicians who get to cast doubt on numbers that might make them look bad. But let's be honest, they never let numbers get in the way of a good spin anyway. The second group are large investment firms with access to their own proprietary data collection techniques. A report from a data firm published by Newswire estimated that investment management firms could spend as much as $15.4 billion this year on alternative data, which really just means anything not published publicly by government agencies or the media. That is 20 times the annual budget of a department like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These firms are regularly employing tactics like using private satellite imagery or just running their own surveys where they will actually pay participants for more timely responses. The better their data is compared to the publicly available data released by government agencies, the more they can make on that data asymmetry. Now, you might think this sounds a little bit like insider trading, but it's not. Technically, the information they are collecting is out there for anybody to collect, and it's not their fault if the average goober on Robinhood doesn't have access to a fleet of spy satellites to collect it. This creates the second major problem with our economic data. It's more profitable to privatize the numbers. The BLS, for example, has 10% fewer staff and a 15% lower budget than it did in 2010 following the global financial crisis, after accounting for inflation. Now, that doesn't sound terrible, but the scope of its operation has also grown considerably in that time, making its job a lot harder overall. The fewer resources they have to actually go and collect primary data, the more they have to rely on guesstimations based on historical correlations. An article, ironically, published by Bloomberg last week, reported that the agency would
No, that he saw you is definitely not a soul you did. It's a way for him to stay out from me.
no longer be collecting consumer prices from certain rural regions due to budget constraints. According to the report, the volume of data they are effectively making up has more than tripled in the last 6 months alone. The reason this is so ironic is because Bloomberg is one of the biggest data retailers in the world. Every one of those black and orange screens filled with random spreadsheets and stock charts you see in videos on trading floors is a Bloomberg terminal. Each one of those computers costs about $30,000 a year in an ongoing subscription. And the reason that big investment firms pay that much is because it gives their staff access to information that just isn't available to regular people. Anyway, budget cuts can create a vicious but convenient cycle for these parties. These departments have their budgets cut, so they don't have as many resources to collect reliable reports. These unreliable reports with big adjustments are then used to show how pointless these departments are, so they get their budget cut even more. The average voter doesn't really understand what these people do. The average politician doesn't like having their work critiqued. And the average industry group would love it if they had a monopoly on good, reliable data. And that's the third major problem that's quickly getting much worse. Even if these numbers were absolutely flawless, are they even relevant anymore? There are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. It's a quote so old that nobody even knows who originally came up with it anymore. But it's remained relevant for hundreds of years. A survey that I ran on all of you while I was putting this video together found that an overwhelming majority did not think that current economic statistics were an accurate reflection of the real economy. Most people who are paying any attention to these numbers while still living in the real world inherently understand this. The idea that what is causing this disconnect is a secretive group of statisticians plotting away behind the scenes to make politicians look bad is frankly pretty dumb. But there is actually an element of truth in it. A report by Cambridge University found that as we have become more politically polarized and less likely to answer surveys, only the most partisan among us actually bother responding to be counted in the data. A business owner who supports a party currently in power is much less likely to respond to a survey with negative economic implications, and they are much more likely to respond if they have good news to share, like having hired new staff. It's less exciting than a shadowy conspiracy, but it is still a problem. Unfortunately, it also just distracts from the bigger problem. A lot of attention is being paid to the referees to see if they are keeping an accurate score, but nobody has stopped to ask why they are monitoring a jousting league. A lot of the data they collect is completely outdated in today's economic landscape. For example, the conditions to count as unemployed are pretty strict, and it doesn't account for a growing number of people who are underemployed or have simply given up on looking for a job altogether. Another absolutely horrible metric we have learned to think is really important is GDP per capita. A smaller channel by the name of Type Ashton did an amazing deep dive into the stupidity of this data point, so instead of ranting about it here, I will leave a link to it down below. The point is, long data series are good for assessing performance in comparison to the guy that came before, but they aren't always the best indication of how things are actually going right now. If this goes on for long enough, people will just stop caring. In fact, they kind of already have. 10 million working-age men have completely dropped out of the workforce, which is yet another example of a trend which is not captured with this data. Go and watch this video to find out why this is happening and how they are surviving without an income. And don't forget to like and subscribe. 4 years ago, America and the rest of the world saw its most intense spike in unemployment in recorded history. In today's news cycle, that is ancient history. But what isn't ignored is what has been left behind. There are now over 10 million people, mostly men in America, who are not working, not studying, not retired, and not institutionalized. They are just doing nothing. COVID accelerated this trend, but it's been going on for decades. Since the 1960s, about 0.1% of American men have given up on work to never come back every single month. So why are so many people giving up so consistently? And more importantly, how are these people surviving without a job in this economy?
In October, Mississippi's labor force participation rate was nearly 54%, while the national rate was over 62%.
How many jobs on these two websites?
It's been over 1,000 combined.
They're not working and they're not looking for a job, and those are the folks who we have to get into the labor market.
Why aren't some Americans getting back to work? It's the million-dollar question.
There are a lot of reasons why someone might not participate in the labor force. They might have retired, they might be still studying for qualifications, there might be people who are too sick to work, stay-at-home spouses, members of the military who are clearly working but don't officially count as part of the labor force, and then of course there are just really rich people who don't need to work to maintain their lifestyle. These groups have always existed, but there is a new group growing alongside them, which are people who have just given up. The fastest growing group of these labor force dropouts have been men between the ages of 25 and 55. Men in this age range would typically be in the prime of their careers, but more and more of them are not working at all. Now, some of this can simply be explained by the fact that more women have entered the workforce. In fact, up until 2008, women were entering the workforce almost as quickly as men were leaving it. Some men just took on domestic roles as stay-at-home husbands while their wives or partners focus on their careers instead. According to Pew Research, young women are now earning significantly more than young men in most major cities in America. Young women are also graduating college at higher rates than men. So it makes sense that a growing group of men are tossing aside typical gender roles and doing work that doesn't get counted as typical employment. If this were the whole story, there would be absolutely nothing wrong with this. But let's be honest. Having a stay-at-home parent, no matter what gender they are, is a luxury that most people simply cannot afford in the modern age, especially young people who are the fastest growing group of labor force dropouts. There is something more going on here. Nicholas Eberstadt is a political economist who published the book Men Without Work, which tracked the trend of working-age men simply giving up on work and largely removing themselves from society in the process. His book, which was first published in 2016, lines up perfectly with a 2022 study on the issue conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which found that men without a college degree in particular were dropping out of work because their earnings power was significantly lower than their peers who did have a 4-year degree. That's not unusual, because college-educated people should expect to earn more than non-college educated workers on average. But the finding found that the gap between the two groups had widened significantly, especially amongst college-educated versus non-college educated men. Now, this was particularly surprising to the researchers because it would actually make more sense that higher income workers would drop out of the labor force, because if they are earning a lot of money, they have a better chance of marrying a higher earning spouse or just saving up more money for an early retirement. Instead, they found the opposite. The group that earned less were more likely to drop out of work. And yes, before you ask, the study did account for the fact that people not working won't be making an income, so they would automatically be in the non-working low-income group. Now, since men are now overrepresented in non-college graduates, they were the largest
Hey, bebe. Hello. Wala pa kayo internet?
of people giving up on work. But even though it's tempting to make this an entirely
Itago ako, ha? Makita akong... Hoy! Nana siya? Oh. Kita na, magilingi.
Kaya wala ra, maski dito ka makita.
Tarang ba?
Promise.
Oh my God.
Hindi lagi ka makita. Mas ka dito ako puti ka. Oh wait, kayo do. Shy type yan. sa introduction ba? Ay, naku.
Gender-specific issue, and to be honest, it would make for a more engaging YouTube video, there are some bigger forces at play here. The reason that people with lower incomes were dropping out was simply because they had less to lose and more to gain. Most unskilled jobs cannot buy you a comfortable lifestyle basically anywhere in America anymore. And as more people tie their identity and social status to their work and income, it's become much harder to accept unglamorous service positions. If you were given two options, honestly consider which one you would choose. You could scrape by working a few minimum wage jobs where you are on your feet dealing with customers and managers all day. A job where you are unlikely to advance too far without a degree, and you won't have much time or energy left at the end of the day to pursue side projects. You might also be working a job that you aren't exactly proud to share with your friends, family, or romantic interests. The other option is that you could scrape by on whatever government programs or family support you could find. Maybe work on some side projects in your spare time, or just fill your day with low-cost recreation like playing video games. I would like to think I appreciate the value of a hard day's work, but I have always had the luxury of a prestigious career and successful business. Given these specific options, how would you choose to spend your day? If you are brave enough, go ahead and share it in the comments below, so people on the internet can call you a bootlicker or a lazy zoomer respectively. Now, the second option also has the advantage that if someone asks you what you do for work, you can just tell them that you are working on a new business or taking some time off. The Fed study found that this was one of the biggest reasons people didn't want to take on jobs that they thought were beneath them. Now, no matter what side of the fence you are on, this issue affects us all. These millions of people are out of work at the same time as we have major issues with worker shortages in our most important industries. And this trend is only going to get worse unless something changes. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how these people are surviving without work and what it means for the rest of the workforce if they never come back. This week's video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant challenging concepts into brilliant computer smart money at a young age, no premium subscription. Apart from a few early retirees that made a lot of money at a young age, most of the people who are not working and are not looking for work are living extremely basic lives. Eberstadt's research went beyond the broader demographic studies and focused a lot on trying to figure out what these people were actually doing with their time. Now, the next few minutes are going to contain some hard-to-swallow pills, and even though Eberstadt is sometimes a bit direct with the way he lays out the facts, his research and his recommendations address some of the most important issues in our society. He found through national surveys that the average man not in work or looking for work was basically doing what you might expect. They were sitting at home, spending a majority of time behind a screen. Most of them contribute very little to looking after other members of a household, and they were underrepresented in other civic activities like volunteering, even though they had more free time than their peers who worked or studied. He also poked holes in the idea that a lot of these men had just become stay-at-home spouses taking care of chores to support their working partner, a role that was, in the past, typically performed by women. Unfortunately, according to the federal survey data he collated, the average labor force dropout spent an equal amount of time on household care as the average employed woman, and 5 minutes less per day than the average unemployed man, who would theoretically be spending at least some of their time looking for a new job. What they were spending their time on was leisure activities and sleeping. The average person who had dropped out of the labor force was also far less likely to have children or a partner, and Eberstadt theorized that there were two reasons for this. The first reason was that children, dating, and a family life are expensive commitments that people trying to get by without a job just simply wouldn't be able to afford. The second reason was that people with a family to support were inherently more motivated to go out and provide, even if it meant working a job that a single person wouldn't. Of course, this is a large sample size, and there are plenty of people with children who don't work and plenty of couples totally outside of the labor force as well. But even without these typical responsibilities, daily life is still very expensive. Government benefits for people out of work typically only extend to those people who are either actively seeking work or cannot work because of an illness or disability. The exact makeup of these assistance programs varies state to state. And of course, outside of America, different countries have different levels of social welfare. But America is where this trend has been most pronounced, and it's also where a bulk of the research on this trend has been done. So as anybody who has ever tried to apply for government welfare in America will tell you, the burden of proof to qualify for these payments can be exceptionally high, with the only real exception being COVID-era stimulus, where arguably the burden of proof for payments was too low. Saying you need unemployment payments because you would prefer to stay at home all day vaping and playing Fortnite isn't going to fly with Uncle Sam. What Eberstadt did find, though, was that it had become much easier for people to qualify for disability payments, which in most circumstances do not require recipients to be actively looking for work to maintain their payments. In his own book, he highlights how difficult it was to find consistent data on all of the government programs that might be available to these people. And of course, needlessly pointing the finger at assistance to some of society's most vulnerable people is not the point here. What is, though, is that according to data from the Department of Social Security, annual disability insurance payments have outpaced all other major programs. They provide the data as a table, but here is a nice visual line chart. Dr. Dwight R. Lee, an economist, also proposed that a major element that Eberstadt overlooked was that a lot of these men were working. They were just doing it in the underground economy, which was estimated to be contributing about $2 trillion, or about 12% of US GDP. This could include these people doing anything from working informal cash jobs to skirt tax and minimum wage laws to outright illegal operations like shoplifting or selling drugs. So the work of these researchers paints an image of this growing group of individuals mooching off friends, family, and the government, while wasting their days away playing video games or being an overall burden on society. It's not exactly flattering, but to be fair, there are certainly people living these lives, and with nationwide or even global demographic trends like this, broad strokes need to be made. The researchers studying this trend are actually highly sympathetic to the situation of these people, and they seem motivated to actually fix the cause of these problems. I will of course be leaving a link to the full book in the video description if you want to read it yourself, as well as some great interviews these men have done that lets them articulate their grim feelings in a way that's a bit more human. The reality is that I can personally see if just a few things went differently in my own life, I could have easily fallen into the same comfortable trap. Most of you watching could have too, whether you realize it or not. But this still doesn't answer the most important question. Why is this becoming more common? Most people, if given the choice, would prefer a nice stable job with an income that could provide a standard of living beyond basic survival. But yet, more and more people are dropping out of even trying to look for a job every single year. There is unfortunately no single answer as to why people are giving up, but there are some contributing factors. Firstly, competition for good prestigious jobs have become far more fierce, while pay for basic jobs has not kept up with living costs. Technology has made it much easier to isolate oneself from the rest of the world, and there are other broader social issues like the opioid epidemic that at the very least have not helped this trend. One of the most damaging factors has been the insidious myth of the skills shortage, which has led to an economy where millions of people don't have a job, but there are millions of jobs that don't have people to fill them. I am going to be writing an article about how the idea of a skills shortage has been used to undermine the traditional career path of millions of Americans over on my free email newsletter linked in the video description. Something like the rise and fall of the tech bro is a clear demonstration that even the most talented and driven workers have less control over their careers than they might like to admit. So if you like this Before the year 2000, if you wanted to make a lot of money in a predictable career, you needed a nice suit and an important-looking business card. Your options were finance, medicine, law, or senior company management if you were lucky. But then, just a few years later, at around the same time as those people in fancy suits were blowing up the global economy, a new breed of millionaire was entering the mainstream. They replaced their puffer vests and Bloomberg terminals with flip-flops and Vim terminals. Tech bros worked fewer hours, had better perks, and in many cases made better money than their peers in more traditional high-income roles. What's more is that people didn't hate them. Executives, bankers, and their fancy lawyers were blamed for enriching themselves by leeching off a broken system that cost people their homes, their jobs, and their futures. Meanwhile, people loved the idea of hacky-sack playing nerds making millions by actually making stuff that improved our lives. But now, 15 years later, the tech bros became everything they promised to destroy. And they kind of destroyed themselves in the process.
New reporting indicates that Facebook is planning a new system to track users' data even as they leave the site.
With a revolutionary new product. What was your vision?
Well, a computer on
Amazon
every
is
desk and in every
to lay
home.
off up to 10,000 workers.
There's Larry, CEO of Google. Say something, Larry. Hi.
At their peak, tech bros enjoyed endless career progression opportunities, options packages that can make them multimillionaires before they are 30, a good work-life balance, and the promise that if they knew how to code, they would always be guaranteed a good job. Today, they are being forced back into the overpriced cities that don't want them there. They are being laid off en masse, and the ones that remain are being told to grind, and they have apparently made programs so good that their CEOs are gleefully talking about a future where entry-level programmers are completely replaced by AI. Between the golden age and the dark ages of tech bros, there have been 3 major changes that both caused their massive rise and their current fall. The first problem was that they simply ran themselves out of business. On Friday, the 10th of March in the year 2000, the Nasdaq hit its then all-time peak. Investors were all in on companies that were ready to take advantage of the internet, and the speculative mania was so fierce that just the mention of .com in their company filings was enough to send their stock price soaring. Eventually, this all collapsed, and only a select few companies from that era have survived to this day. The reality was that the internet was an amazing technology that would go on to change our lives and facilitate some of the most valuable companies in history. But just putting a normal business on a website wasn't actually revolutionary. What came after was a genuine golden era of tech services. The companies that survived the dot-com bubble were actually useful, and the cleansing of the market meant that more talent and investment could go towards supporting companies that actually did provide a good service. Early YouTube, MySpace, Facebook, Amazon, and online gaming were all novel and genuinely great services that if you are as old as me, you probably remember finding them absolutely amazing. There was still money flowing into them, and the tech sector rode out the global financial crisis better than most. The first iPhone was released in 2007, and even at the height of layoffs and corporate bankruptcies in 2008, people were still lined up around the block to buy the iPhone 3G. You were told that if you learned how to code, you would be sure of a good job. And at the same time, companies like Apple and Google were being named as the most desirable places to work thanks to their relaxed corporate attitude, excellent work-life balance, amazing employee perks, and surprisingly competitive salaries. Most importantly, these companies were still not the establishment. They were scrappy startups making products that people actually enjoyed. After the dot-com crash, it took the Nasdaq over 15 years to recover from its previous peak. This meant that thanks to employee stock options, these mid-2000s tech bros were making good money, but they would likely still be out-earned by their finance bro peers, assuming they weren't laid off in 2008. That slowly changed though, and as these companies grew, more money flowed into the industry, and with more money came more workers, bigger bonuses, stock options, and it went from an alternative industry filled with nerds making products that people enjoyed to the industry making products that would secure funding from a growing pool of investors. They went from the business of adding value through technology to extracting value through monopolies. For a while, you could have a great degree of confidence in becoming filthy rich by putting in a few years at a major Silicon Valley tech company. But all this relied on a stream of money that wasn't coming from nowhere. Venture capital, the firms that actually invest in early-stage startups to develop their new technology, never again actually reached the level of funding it did during the dot-com bubble. That was until something changed in 2021. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how tech bros ruined tech for themselves. This week's video is sponsored by Delete Me. Delete Me is a hands-free service designed to remove your personal information from by how much of my and offers plans supporting your personal data percent off.
Gamble and go to the fucking game dev community instead of
Don't wait. Protect your information today. As tech companies grew larger and more valuable, the rush to hire more talent heated up. By the mid-2010s, if you had a talented developer, you could easily out-earn any other career out of college by working for a company like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, hire more talent heated up. By the mid-2010s, if you had a talented developer, you could easily out-earn any other career out of college by working for a company like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, or Google, the so-called FANG companies. These businesses all had established platforms, but they still hired tens of thousands of developers and paid them very well for a few reasons. The first was that they were constantly trying to add new features to their core offerings, and even maintaining a platform like YouTube takes a lot of work to keep up to date with customer demands. The homepage of the site today looks very different from even 5 years ago. There was also an exuberance where newer companies like Uber, Airbnb, Twitch, Snapchat, Tinder, and even WeWork were scaling their operations so fast that they would hire developers before they even had a defined project for them to work on, because hiring when they actually needed staff would slow them down. This was part of a relatively new tech industry strategy called blitzscaling, a not-so-subtle reference to the Blitzkrieg of World War II, which was all about capturing as much territory as possible as quickly as possible, using new technology before the enemies could respond. Supply lines couldn't keep up, but the hope was that once a territory was captured, the German army could sort all of that out later. Now, clearly, tech companies are not rolling tanks through Belgium, but they are using the scalability of technology to capture market share in industries like food delivery, taxis, holiday rentals, and online dating as quickly as possible, and then sorting out things like what to do with all their staff later on. In an interview published by the Harvard Business Review, Reid Hoffman, a Silicon Valley venture capitalist and one of the founders of PayPal and LinkedIn, said that companies that are blitzscaling may need to get as many warm bodies through the door as possible as quickly as you can. Another reason why tech bros are being hired as quickly as possible was that hiring lots of staff was a great way to make sure that they couldn't go to potential competitors, especially startups that could, and I really hate to say this, but disrupt the industries of the big incumbent players. Acquiring competitor companies as they start to take market share could get companies in trouble with the FTC for anti-competitive practices, but there were no rules against denying them to staff that they would need to get their business going in the first place. A report by the Wall Street Journal interviewed tech workers who admitted to being hired to do nothing at all, and that the businesses were hoarding developers like Pokemon cards. That made it all worse when high interest rates, reduced market certainty, and lower customer demand for a lot of these tech products resulted in mass layoffs across the industry. Businesses that were blitzscaling either shut down or shifted gears to only hire workers they really actually needed. New feature development slowed down, and big established companies didn't need to worry about hoarding workers away from their competitors anymore because nobody was hiring. Artificial intelligence is also already doing a lot of the grunt work that is typically given to new employees. Tech companies by their nature are more open to adopting these new technologies, and even replacing just a handful of entry-level developers can save companies millions of dollars every year, so it really is an ideal environment for automation. This was the second major blow to the tech bros. They traded in the promise of a very stable career for something that has become an incredibly risky game of survival. You can make a lot of money in technology, but your success is going to depend just as much on picking the right company or startup at the right time to invest in as it is on your own personal skills development. An entry-level developer that started working with Intel 5 years ago had a good chance of being laid off last month with stock options that are worth absolutely nothing. A similarly skilled developer that took a job with Nvidia at the same time, on the other hand, probably never needs to work again in their life. The ones that got lucky go out, and the ones that got let go are sick of playing the stock market with their careers. If they wanted to do that, they would have become finance bros. And then there's the biggest problem of all. Workers want to be close to job opportunities, and companies want to be close to workers, so the whole industry has agglomerated in just a handful of locations. These cities have become incredibly expensive, and infrastructure has not been able to scale as fast as these companies, which means it's not unusual for tech workers making six figures to share a two-bedroom apartment with 3 other highly paid local workers. Ask me how I know. If you are a tech worker struggling to afford a place to live on a 6-figure salary, then there is basically no hope for other workers in these cities, which are still essential to keep society functioning. As a result, big tech cities have not only become expensive places to live, they have also become not particularly nice places to live. Remote work could have alleviated these issues by easing demand in these small markets, but the big tech companies now have a lot more negotiating power over workers who don't want to be another layoff statistic, and they are using that power to mandate a return to office. Even Zoom, the company developing remote working solutions, has pulled its teams back into the office. These problems also don't come with many upsides for locals. The big sell is that these companies offer great jobs, but most of these jobs go to people who are not local and only move to the city after they secure a role and then compete with locals for housing and other services. I personally moved to San Francisco from out of state after I got a job at an investment bank, so even though I was technically a finance bro, I was still very much a part of the problem. Other areas have gone from welcoming tech companies opening up operations in their cities to actively pushing back against it. And this all represents a trend which is way larger than
Okay.